You're listening to Nightlight Radio Network. This is Dr. Bob Hieronimus, co-host of 21st Century Radio. We are happy to present this rebroadcast of our show on Nightlight. As far back as about, I think it was 1991, 21st Century Radio has been reporting on developments in cold fusion with dozens of updates from Gene Malov and others. But we have been talking about another energy genius for even longer. You can see portraits of one of our great heroes, Nikola Tesla, throughout our tape catalog of 1988, 22 years ago. Our guest tonight is going to update us both on Nikola Tesla and the advancements in future energy. Dr. Thomas Valone is a physicist and licensed professional engineer with 30 years of professional experience. He is a patent examiner, research engineer, instrumentation designer, and consultant on future energy developments. He is president and founder of Integrity Research Institute and the author of 0 Point Energy, the Fuel of the Future, the Homopolar Handbook, and about 100 published reports and articles. He has appeared on CNN, A&E, and Discovery Channel as a frequent guest on Coast to Coast with our friend George Norrie. He served as guest editor for the most recent edition of Infinite Energy, the magazine of new energy science and technology, founded by our dear friend, passed on, murdered actually, was Gene Malov. This issue is devoted to Nikola Tesla, and we're going to focus on these articles among other topics tonight. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, Tom.
Glad to be here. Hi, Bob.
Tom, it's been 11 years.
I'm surprised it's been that long. 11
years since you last joined us. Well, that's one of the problems of doing a weekly show. When we did daily shows, we could cover topics, all kinds of topics repeatedly. But when you do them once a week, it changes everything.
I understand.
Now, Nikola Tesla, who was he and what did he accomplish?
Well, Tesla was Yugoslavian, and he established our AC electricity system. That is something that should be in the textbooks and taught to every school child throughout America. And it is over in Europe. But the United States has been sort of deprived of that for some reason. Edison dominates the electricity story, and yet it was the power of the currents, battle of the currents, actually, around the turn of the last century that had Edison and Tesla go head-to-head for the Pan American exhibition, for example, in Chicago, and also there was one in Buffalo, my hometown, where I actually had a chance to research Tesla's history in Niagara Falls.
What a great place to do it. Jeez, it whiz.
Yeah, first man to transmit electricity for 20 miles.
Well, why do you think mainstream science in this country has done all it can to ignore him? And they have done all they can to ignore him.
Well, really, when you look back at the history, and that's how to answer this question, and it gets asked often, actually. You see the battle between Tesla and J.P. Morgan, and there's a very interesting movie on Tesla, that history of Tesla, that has Orson Welles playing J.P. Morgan, and it's a very powerful movie, a biography of his life. And you get to this confrontation after the Wardenclyffe Tower has been built in Long Island in 1903, and he's coming back for a little bit more money to finalize the project and transmit not only signals but power across the ocean. J.P. Morgan then asked, well, how am I going to collect money from it? How can I put a meter on it, in other words? And Tesla had no answer because he didn't care. He was more interested in giving power to the world, you know. That was his main philanthropic goal. And of course, that became the falling out and the separation between the partnership that had built the tower. And then we basically became victims of a umbilical cord electrical grid that's cost billions to build and now is actually aging and causing problems. So what I want to conclude the story with is J.P. Morgan's dictate to maybe 3 or 4 textbook publishers at the time, around 1905, and he asked them to remove Tesla from their textbooks, from the history books. And it was easy to do. He just called them up, called up a couple publishers, the only ones in existence for school books. And from then on, Tesla was left out of most of the information and the history.
Well, that was quite a shock to me when I first heard about this around 20-some years ago. I couldn't believe that I was so naive, Tom. I actually believed the propaganda that, boy, man, if we had another system of energy systems out there, that we would do everything we possibly could to bring them to the table and to expedite. But that's not at all what happened.
That's a naive point of view.
Yeah, sure. Well, I was one of those guys that I really felt that the media was on our side, which certainly it was not. And it depends on who owns the media, and that certainly is going to control everything. And as soon as President Reagan gave permission for NBC to be owned by General Electric, that seemed to change absolutely everything in regards to our major media being anything but a supporter. And of course, President Reagan worked for General Electric all those decades. It's strange that the media never brought that up. Yep. Now, Eugene Malov, he was the founder of Infinite Energy magazine, was he not?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What would you say? Now, he was murdered in 2004, and I don't believe those who were responsible were ever caught. It's a very. Have you learned anything more recently about who may have murdered him?
I haven't followed the story too much ever since a decade ago when it happened, but it's really been a sad story, and certainly we all miss his great contribution to the field. Cold fusion.
Sure. He was. I was introduced to him through a dear friend of mine, Christopher Bird. Remember Chris Bird?
Yes, I do.
Secret Life of Plants, Secrets of the Soil, and the Divining Hand, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he and Peter Tompkins used to hang out together in good old Washington, D.C. We would spend a good deal of time looking at new researchers, and of course, if you know Chris, you know what his home was like. I mean, every week, some major researcher was living there, staying there, passing through, or what have you. And he was the person that really told me, if you want to focus on alternative energies, Eugene Malov was the man to do that. Sure. And that's one of the reasons why at times we were able to support Infinite Energy magazine monetarily, because obviously it's something that needs more of it. Eugene Malov, what would you say his major contribution was? Well,
he obviously was the speaking voice of the cold fusion community for many years. Infinite Energy magazine specialized in cold fusion information. But I also have to give him credit for a $10,000 support of our first conference on future energy that was originally planned for the State Department and then got me fired from the patent office, and then was held at a local hotel in Bethesda, Maryland in 1999.
Were you shocked about that? I mean, did it shock you that would happen to you?
Absolutely. It was a total surprise. We were planning for a year up to the month before, and then Bob Park, American Physical Society, decided to devote every single week to a criticism of our Future Energy Conference. Oh. And the bad press became so onerous that the Department of Commerce, Department of Energy, and the State Department all riled against me. And I was in Science Magazine, Nature Magazine, and basically labeled as a pseudoscientist.
Well,
because I had one cold fusion speaker.
Well, that's amazing. Bob Park, Dr. Park, I'm just amazed at how much he got away with. I mean, he got away.
They finally got rid of him at the APS. But
it was about time.
As far as sponsoring his weekly diatribe on the internet.
Oh yeah, I mean he was just plain mean. It was just plain mean. Yeah, and we had a little prayer vigil. All. Remember when the tree fell on him?
Yeah. So he published my email to him, giving him symbolic analysis of why that tree fell on him.
Oh, that was really
he called himself Dr. Oak, and then an oak tree hit him. I thought that was perfect justice.
Yes.
It was a universal
it
karma
was.
coming back to him.
Well, I thought he kind of deserved it, but it's it's tough to get hit on the head with a tree.
Oh,
but anyway, I think it was a statement that needed to be made by somebody,
yes.
Since the media wasn't going to pay attention to it.
No.
Now, Infinite Energy magazine has really grown in the sense that it's a lot more than just cold fusion, as you mentioned a little earlier.
That's the beauty of it. Yeah, and this major issue now on Tesla is a proof of it.
Oh, it's fascinating. It's fantastic. This is issue number 89. It's called The Electrical Genius of Nikola Tesla, and contains 7 new original articles and 1 reprint of the Tesla's paper and a letter. And that's what I'd like to do now, and go down to some of these articles, and then I'd like to turn around and talk a little about some of the other things you personally have accomplished.
Sure. Do you mind if I at least give a plug for Infinite Energy magazine?
Well,
the editor, Christy, asked us in the emails to do so, to drive some traffic that way, hopefully.
Well, of course we should do that.
Infinite-energy.com is the website. Infinite with a hyphen, infiniteenergy.com. And for $6, they can get the latest issue, which is on the homepage.
Just $6?
That's right.
Just $6 for all of this information?
That's right. Everything we're talking about now, anyone can go to the website, infinite-energy.com, and for $6, order the current issue.
Well,
no obligation to get anything else.
Well, friends, once you get one issue, you're going to feel obligated because this is extraordinary stuff. It really is.
And the other nice thing she did was to put the article, Fight to Preserve Tesla's Wardenclyffe Laboratory from Marianne Macy, on the website in its entirety.
Well, that was a real coup. That really was. Now, as we mentioned, there's 7 new original articles, and then there's a reprint of the Tesla one. Let's start with Marianne Macy's The Fight to Preserve. Sometimes I can read my writing. The Fight to Preserve Tesla's Wardenclyffe Laboratory. What can you tell us about this article?
Well, the important part is the history, first of all. Very few people in the world know what Tesla did in 1903 on Long Island with the Wardenclyffe Tower. Even PhD electrical engineers, there's one, for example, at the University of Virginia, who just wrote a biography of Tesla. And I sent him my book, Harnessing the Wheelwork of Nature, because he made the statement that no one in the world understands Tesla's wireless.
So that's why we should ignore it, because no one understands it, right?
Well, he was wrong in stating that, and you're right. They shouldn't be ignored just because of that,
But science has turned into scientism. I mean, well, excuse me, I better shut up here. I get kind of worked up about this, Tom.
Absolutely, I get emotional too. But to summarize for the listeners, the important part is that, first of all, you've got a tower with a dome on it, and electrical engineers start scratching their head trying to figure out what the heck that is, because we've been hypnotized to believe the Marconi single-wire tower is all that's necessary to transmit RF. Mm-hmm. And so we have line-of-sight transmission with transverse waves, thinking that's the only thing possible.
Right.
But instead, Tesla went out to Colorado Springs for several years, proved that he could transmit energy around the world, 50 years before Schumann ever discovered the Schumann resonance, 8 cycles per second, of the Earth ionosphere cavity. And he proved that he could get 95% transmission efficiency instead of about the 33% currently we get with the National Electric Grid.
Isn't that amazing? 33%?
Incredible.
We're going to accept 33%. That's okay. And that's all we're ever going to get out of it, so don't worry about it.
Yeah, we lose terawatts of energy because of the change in J.P. Morgan's direction. Mm-hmm. And then we followed his lead. But the important part is here's a dome tower issuing longitudinal waves that are different than transverse waves. And that's the puzzling beginning where Edison said, it doesn't behave like Kirchhoff's laws. It doesn't obey Kirchhoff's laws, so I don't understand it, and therefore it can't work.
Yeah, that's right. It shouldn't work if it doesn't obey that law.
Yeah, if Edison doesn't understand it, got to throw it out. So the important part is after 14 years, they destroyed the tower. The building is still there, built by a famous architect, And the hope is for hundreds of people now that are supporting the Tesla Science Center at Wardenclyffe, P.O. Box 552, Shoreham, New York, 11786. That's the address for any donations to this cause, which will be matched by another private donor up to $850,000 to buy the property and turn it into a museum.
You mean if somebody donates $850,000, this other person's going to donate $850,000?
Yes, that's the maximum.
God bless their soul. Mm-hmm. God bless them. Are you allowed to say who that is, or they just want it to be anonymous? Councilman
Alessi has discussed the possibility of making 6 months to a year bridge loan to match the $850,000 from New York State. So it is New York State that's providing it, and there's hope that either donations or the loan or combination thereof will provide the $1.7 million they need to buy the property.
Well, we're just going to have to award the New York State, one of the best states in the United States of America, just on that alone. I'm not even biased about that.
Sure.
But
they can also go to, excuse me for interrupting, TeslaScienceCenter.org.
TeslaScienceCenter.org?
All one word, yep, to get all the information about their plans to preserve and resurrect this project.
We need to take our first break, Tom, and we'll be back with Dr. Tom Valone, the electrical genius of Nikola Tesla and electromagnetic healing devices, a special issue of Infinite Energy magazine. Tom Valone served as guest editor of this issue, and you can read more about him at integrityresearchinstitute.org. Subscribe to Infinite Energy magazine by calling 603-485-4700, 603-485-4700, or on their website at infinite-energy.com. And we have covered the Infinite Energy magazine. The latest edition was the electrical genius of Nikola Tesla and his electromagnetic healing devices. But Tom Valone himself is a legend in his own time, and we're going to touch on some of the things that he's accomplished over the past several decades. As a matter of fact, before we touch on that, 15 years ago, you were the originator and technical consultant for the well-known documentary that has won several awards, Free Energy, The Race to Zero Point. How did you get started in this field, Tom?
Actually, it was around 1980, and I tell the story in my new book, The Future of Energy, an Emerging Science, and I'll send you a few copies to be able to give away.
That would be great.
And it was actually in 1980. I became interested in a magnetic motor that was out in the West Coast in California called the sunburst machine. And it was described in a book called The Sunburst Return of the Ancients by Norman Paulson, who recently passed away. And it was a strange book because it combined yoga and also UFOs and described the fact that this magnetic motor could provide electricity and anti-gravity. So, of course, as a young scientist, I was very interested. I called up the community and got permission to come out to visit. And it took me a couple days before they would show me the motor. And then I went back and decided, hey, I'm going to build one of these. So I convinced my professor at the University of Buffalo Physics Department to let me decide on what master's degree project I could do rather than the usual. The professor dictates what conventional stuff you're supposed to build to get a master's degree. So I was happy enough to at least test the motor for back torque, and then I became sort of a regular every year ever since. I've been attending conferences and giving talks and really become an advocate for free energy.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Integrity Research Institute, or IRI. When did it get started, and how did it get started? What's its mission?
Well, it got started around 1990, and then it changed names in 2000 to reincorporate so that we could become a 501c3 charitable organization. And its mission really is to research scientific integrity in the areas of energy, propulsion, and bioenergetics. And that has been program areas for all three for many years now. And so we have proposals and products and reports and books devoted to energy, propulsion, and bioenergetics.
Well, how much integrity is there in science dealing with energies?
Well, that's what we're trying to distill. The 95% or so that you have to sift through the sifter in order to find it. But I'm happy to say that the Center for Science and the Public Interest and also the Union for Concerned Scientists both have a scientific integrity program.
Now,
so we're in good company in the Washington, D.C. area.
You sure are, and especially now since the X conference and UFOs is all going to be taking place in Washington, D.C. this spring. Again, I think it's May, in the beginning of May somewhere. Sure. Was that the press office? Is it the press office?
Well, they're going to have it at the National Press Club, and you should come to it, Bob, really.
This
is a historic occasion. They normally have the press conference way up in Gaithersburg, but now they're going to have the National Press Club as the center.
Yeah.
And a lot of media show up. It's the most well-attended event, I would say, in the Washington, D.C. area that's non-political.
Well, we're looking forward to it. As a matter of fact, our guest last week, is that right, Dr. Kortner? Was our guest last week? Yes.
Stephen Bassett.
Yeah, Stephen. Brother Stephen talked to us about it. And by the way, we hadn't had Stephen on the show for 9 years. I'll tell you. But you mentioned last hour something happened in 1999 with the State Department when you were put together the conference on future energy.
Right.
And then lost your job at the patent office because of it. Is that because there's a lot of integrity there going on?
Well, the U.S. government may have a problem with that area because essentially they're driven by the media.
Yeah.
And now, of course, corporations are going to get into the push as well.
Oh, corporations wouldn't do anything like that.
No, of course not. But the important thing for my experience directly was that I saw politicians and government workers with PhDs who should be full of integrity and honesty. Basically, what I learned is the word mendacity. Mm-hmm. Mendacity is a little bit beyond making fabricated stories. It means you actually are professional at doing so.
Yeah, well, they are. I'll never forget that conference at Johns Hopkins. I'm trying to remember the year, but I can't. My mind's being blocked on that right now. I got so upset by what was going on when they put down cold fusion to absolutely, they zilched it, literally. And then they lied. They were caught in lies, but it made no difference in the Maryland area because Johns Hopkins, Johns Hopkins, and I've been affiliated with that institution for 40 years.
In fact, I'll be there in February, just next month, for the Space Power Energy Symposium.
Oh, maybe we can get together on that.
Yeah, I'm giving a paper on a magnetic motor that I've developed.
Hey, that at Hopkins?
Yes, Johns Hopkins.
Well, it's about time. Gosh, they're waking up there. Now, electrogravitics and electrokinetics. Mm-hmm. You've written 2 books on these, presented at various aeronautics and space conferences about it. Tell us a little bit about the importance of these books.
Well, the exciting part of electrogravitics 1 and 2, electrogravitic systems and electrogravitics volume 2, is that I'm first of all giving credit to Townsend Brown for his work in developing electrokinetics. Wow. And this is perhaps a mislabeling of the process and the science that he developed, but historically recognizing the Institute, Aviation Studies Institute in London, who back in 1954 actually authored a couple reports on electrogravitics, which are reprinted in the first volume. So that's the starting point of a very intriguing aerospace or aerodynamics movement and push to develop a different type of propulsion. And something strange happened a few years after that, before 1960, where all of that information was no longer available. And Townsend Brown and also his colleague, Bonson, started to produce patents on electrokinetics, but they left electrogravitics behind.
Oh.
You only see that mentioned in the first patent, the British patent, and it's a process that depends on mass. Well, to put a long story short, there's a story that's reprinted in Volume 2 that is How I Control Gravity by Townsend Brown, and it has a very intriguing series of experiments, all of which involve pretty heavy pendulum type of suspended masses. And in one case, he's got 44-pound masses on either side of a bar, a glass bar, suspended by a string or a rope. and he adds a pulse of electricity, and it starts to turn. And he describes the entire current path so you can tell which way the electricity is going. And he's intrigued and puzzled by the fact that it goes back to the starting point immediately afterwards. He said, even though the electricity is still being applied. So he basically went to his grave never figuring out why that was happening. And what I did is I put together all of these anomalous stories that I had accumulated ever since 1980, where I went over to Germany and actually represented De Palma for the homopolar motor that I was building, homopolar generator, and I wrote a book on that. But the important part is that I met Zinsser, for example, who had a pulsed electricity propulsion system, and we actually published a book on Zinsser's electrodynamic propulsion system. And there's several other examples of pulse propulsion that have never been correlated, would you say? Well, the solution to that turns out to be Dr. Jeff Menko, the same one I mentioned earlier, who wrote a book on electrostatic motors. He wrote another book on causality that includes the electrokinetic equation. And I even wrote to him afterwards. I said, why did you call it electrokinetic equation? Did you know Townsend Brown produced a whole bunch of patents on electrokinetics? And he didn't.
Oh.
This was a parallel path inventors, two of which worked on the same thing, solved the same problem, and one's got the equation, the other's got the experiment, and they never talked to each other.
Holy cow. Wow.
And the equation predicts that a pulse of current will produce a force, but the sustained current or sustained voltage will not. It'll be a very weak force.
Mm-hmm.
So pulsed electrokinetics is now a new form of propulsion. And the interesting thing is, I've been at, for example, the Utah Space Society conference in a panel with some very prominent NASA folks, and Zubrin, for example, was one of them. And of course, they questioned all this electrogravitics, couldn't believe it, and so forth. And then I asked one of the contractors, aerospace contractors, to stand up in the audience, and he announced, who I'd met the night before, of course, and he announced to the audience, he said, I levitated a hockey puck. Oh. And of course, Zubrin and the rest, all the skeptics shut up after that. And it was an asymmetric capacitor. He applied pulse to high voltage and it levitated.
Boy, that seldom happens in life. But, to actually have some confirmation right away when you needed it. Last week, one of the topics we covered was a book dealing with contactees, UFO contactees. Mm-hmm. And one of the few that Chris Bird and Peter Tompkins had great admiration for was George Van Tassel.
Right, I do too.
Is there any connection of your research to Van Tassel's research and his integratron?
Absolutely. In fact, I discuss that in the new book, Future of Energy. I've given lectures. In fact, there is a videotape, for example, a DVD, called Future Energy, and that specifically has a presentation I've given on this subject, energy technology of UFOs. Because I was so surprised that, ever since 1980, the UFO theme has kind of followed me, and I even went to Stephen Bassett's X conference and gave the same presentation. So to put a long story short, Van Tassel was the source of information for Norman Paulson's book, Sunburst, Return of the Ancients, and all of his UFO experiences. Van Tassel was able to attract UFOs even in daytime, and the photographs are shown actually in my book and also his book. But the exciting part is he had direct contact as well, or so he says, and that's how he built the integratron. Well, the two things that came out of the Van Tassel work are basically the instructions to Paulson to build a magnetic motor, but also the integratron seems like it's designed, and I've been there and photographed it and talked to the owners now, it seems like an inverted Tesla coil. And it's very exciting to be inside it because you see the unfinished work of a coil that's designed to be a primary and secondary underneath the floor of a very perfectly hemispheric acoustic chamber.
Well, Tesla was used to the little, I used to call them, I think they're called ball lightning, but they're balls of plasma.
Yeah.
And of course, that was one of the interesting things about the book on contactees, actually showing these ball lightning inside of the integratron. I had a photograph of it in there. So, do you have a copy of that book on contactees?
No, I don't. But I've seen those types of photographs even around crop circles being formed.
Well, if you're interested in the copy, let us know. We'll send you one in here. Gosh, we're almost out of time here. What did Al Gore tell you when you met with him?
He basically said that when I was indicating that the increased carbon dioxide from global warming would not increase the growth of trees, according to a recent study, he said he already knew that.
Oh.
And so I criticized him for not announcing it to the public. But of course, there's lots of other things we talked about too.
Oh, I'm sure. He's a great man. Really is a great man. Now, do you think that the U.S. government is hiding advanced energy or propulsion technology that could solve the global warming or the global cooling crisis?
Or the energy crisis? Yeah. Absolutely. I've had several examples, and I tell stories in this new video. Actually, there's another one called "The World Needs a New Energy," which I also have. It's available from lightworksav.com. That also indicates these stories. Frank Mead, for example, the former director of the Air Force Research Lab. I tell a story about his life and what he experienced and the suppression he experienced throughout his career.
Yeah. Well, more recently, of course, the situation with General Motors. And I'm sure you've seen the DVD, Who Killed the Electric Car?
Absolutely. We presented actually that at the 2006 Conference on Future Energy. And we even brought Chelsea Sexton here to Beltsville, Maryland.
Wonderful lady. Just wonderful lady. The greatest red hair in the world. Brilliant. Just dedicated. I mean, these people are really dedicated. And, of course, what most people are unaware of, and we try to let people introduce people to what General Motors was doing as they purchased the Hummer and decided that was the way to go and to eliminate all their electrical cars. Now they're rebuilding them.
Absolutely.
Interesting karma. It's just too bad that the guys that really got away with this back there in early 90s are still in power, which really gets me sometimes.
Yeah. But I really think, Bob, that as we do come across with breakthroughs, which I'm happy to say I've signed in a couple NDAs, so I'm confident that we do have energy breakthroughs that are just around the corner, and they're being tested right now in major laboratories. That once we do, those other automobile companies and oil companies, they're going to be very powerless when people have independent portable power.
And do you think that that's one of the reasons why some of this stuff is just either ignored or refused to be looked at?
Absolutely. Chain Reaction, the movie with Keanu Reeves and Morgan Freeman, it's a good example where they have the confrontation, and Morgan Freeman says, as the banker, free energy, noble concept, but what about the economic impact? Markets would fail all over the world and everything. So,
and who cares?
Sure.
Who cares about the poor people? Well, who cares about people? I mean, they're not important. I mean, from that standpoint. As we might be able to watch a little bit more of that as with the kind of Supreme Court that we have. That's going to be one terrible battle in the years to come. I think we can all see that, and it's going to be a toughie too. Dr. Thomas Valone, thank you for joining us again. And don't be so scarce.
Okay.
Every 11 years. Actually, that's our fault, listeners. Okay. That's our fault because we have too many people trying to get on this show, and we try to stretch it out over a period of time, but it's not an easy thing to do. Thank you for joining us. And, of course, if you want to reach the Integrity Research Institute.org, we suggest you go to that website, integrityresearchinstitute.org, and also subscribe to the Infinite Energy Magazine by calling 603-485-4700 or on their website, infinite-energy.com. 21st Century Radio is produced by Hieronimus and Company. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus, and remember, shine your shoes and get a haircut.